Thanks for that. Let's get a bit less light on the matter, cast a bit of darkness. Okay, this is an image of a statue which stood on the staircase of the zoology department at the University of Edinburgh when I was a student there in the 1960s, and I was a student there and on the staff there for about 10 years. And I walked past it every day, probably thousands of times, and never really concerned myself about what it actually meant. It's still there. And one thing has changed. When I was an undergraduate and postgraduate, it was just sitting there. Now it's screwed down. Whether that's progress or not, I don't know. But actually, I did, through curiosity, look up what it actually tried to show. And if you look at it, you can see a chimpanzee with a puzzled look on its face, human skull in its hand, and sitting on a pile of books, one of which is by guess who, the man after whom this lecture is named, Charles Darwin. And it's open at a particular page where it says, Eritis sicut Deus. Now, all of you, of course, like me, being of a certain age, have done O-level Latin, no doubt. Not that I remember much about it. But actually, what that is, it's a quote from the Vulgate, the Latin version of the Bible, from Genesis, from the 3rd chapter. And as the serpent persuades Eve to pluck the fruit, to eat the fruit of the tree of evil, it says, Eritis sicut Deus, scientes bonum et malum. In the day ye eat thereof, then ye shall eyes be opened, and ye shall be as gods, knowing of good and evil. And my recent book, and you don't have to go and buy it, my recent book, The Serpent's Promise, is a perhaps rather rash attempt to rewrite the Bible from a scientist's point of view, as if it were a scientific textbook, in its attempts to explain the world, the origin of disease, things like floods, things like visions and the like. And I don't propose to go into that side of it particularly. I have to tell you, I don't know whether God evolved or not. I don't know whether God exists or not. But I'm very convinced that belief evolved and belief exists. So that's what I'm going to explore. I'm going to ask, what is it that science, if anything, that science can tell us about religion in the general sense? Can it tell us anything, for example, briefly, about religious experiences? Can it even suggest how religion began and even where it might be going? Okay. Well, Darwin was well aware. Darwin was greatly criticized by the religious by the church and others, and still is, on the grounds, perhaps, that he dragged humankind down to the level of the apes. Queen Victoria went to London Zoo and saw this. She's the one on the left, by the way. She saw this orangutan, and described in her diary, and she was a very intelligent woman, frightfully and painfully and disagreeably human. Okay? And it was really rather alarming to think that perhaps we were indeed related to just that, to a primate. Well, Darwin suggested that religion had originated and evolved in some way, in just one phrase, and certainly plenty of people agree with him. There are lots and lots of books on how religion appeared. Darwin's Cathedral, Big Gods, How Religion Transformed Cooperation and Conflict, The Biological Evolution of Religious Mind and Behavior, and so on. You notice I haven't bought any of these books. I've just downloaded the covers from Amazon. I shouldn't do that as an author myself. And there have been various attempts to study religion scientifically. Perhaps the first one was by our own distinguished not exactly alumnus, but supporter, Francis Galton. Galton was Charles Darwin's cousin, a man of extraordinary genius, who left a large sum of money to UCL in the early part of the 20th century to found what was then called the National Laboratory of Eugenics, but rather quickly had a rather embarrassed change of title to the Galton Laboratory, and quite recently changed his title again, to my annoyance, to the Department of Genetics, Evolution and Environment. And Galton was interested in many things, and he was a statistician, and one of the first things he applied statistics to was prayer. He asked, is it the case, he wrote a paper called On the Statistical Efficacy of Prayer, is it the case that people who are frequently prayed for, kings and queens, shall we say, do they live longer as a result? It's a perfectly reasonable question. He took large numbers of data. He found 97 members of royal houses, 244 doctors, 1,632 members of the gentry, and lo and behold, the sovereigns are literally the shortest lived of all who have the advantage of affluence. The prayer has therefore no efficacy. Doesn't work, all right? Well, as you can imagine, he got into a certain amount of trouble about that. How else might we indeed interpret religion through the scientific eyes? And there have been many attempts with brain scans and genetics, and there's quite a strong heritability of being religious, as there is for everything else. I thought I'd just briefly mention one approach, which is see can we understand any of the many visions and apparitions which appear in the Bible through a biologist's eyes. And here's Hildegard of Bingen's visions, and she was, of course, a wonderful composer from, I think, the 12th, 13th century, became a saint, Saint Hildegard of Bingen, and she frequently saw visions. I saw a great star, an exceeding multitude of falling stars, all annihilated, turned to black coals and cast into the abyss. She was also a considerable artist, and these are what she sketched, and these are examples of Hildegard's visions. What could that be due to? Well, it's been suggested that actually many of us, certainly I, may suffer or have the same experiences, because rather occasionally I get very mild migraines and I get what's called a scotoma. And what a scotoma is a turning, many of you may have experienced them, a turning, a bright patch in your visual field, often brightly colored, sometimes blocks out part of the visual field. And that actually is a fairly precise description, perhaps, of her visions. And other people have had the same condition. There's a well-known clergyman who wrote a well-known book called Alice in Wonderland, Lewis Carroll. He himself clearly had severe problems with scotoma. And he wrote frequently of seeing these odd effects of not seeing part of the visual field. And you can see that in Alice in Wonderland. It's actually called Alice in Wonderland syndrome. One of the effects of having severe migraine is sometimes you think you're stretching or getting, as you're on the left, or you're getting very big, as in the room there, or you think you're swimming. You feel as if you're surrounded by water. And a very nice one is the Cheshire Cat. The Cheshire Cat, of course, just sat there and slowly disappeared until only the smile was left. And that's a classic scotoma, because there's a bright patch in Lewis Carroll's vision, which if he looks at the cat, he only sees the smile. He can't see the rest of it. Okay. So that's visions. And I could go on a lot about visions, but I'm going to ask perhaps a more general question, is how and when did organized religion, as we understand it, begin? And there have been lots and lots of theories about that. Certainly there are evolutionary theories, there are sociological theories, and there's plenty of evidence. There's plenty of fossils, literary fossils, in terms of religious books, and of course physical fossils in the terms of great cathedrals and the like. And indeed fossils in the sense that we can look at existing religions and see if we can see things in common which may allow us to trace an ancestry. And James Fraser, who was a London-based sociologist, in 1890 wrote a book called The Golden Bough. And he suggested that actually all the faiths of the Mediterranean, by which he included Christianity, Islam, Judaism, various Greek gods and the like, the Roman gods, had something, most of them had something in common. And what they had in common was that he suggested that they began as fertility rites for crops. Because in the Mediterranean, of course, you got the death of plants and animals in the dry season, then a long period of hunger, then some rain, and miraculously, there's a resurrection of the plants as the rain consecrates its marriage with the earth. And in ancient times, a god-king was sacrificed every year to make the rains come. He was given a last meal, not realizing perhaps it was his last meal. He was then sacrificed, and when the rains came, another god-king was elected, and you had the basis of a great number of religious beliefs. Well, that could be true, but in fact we can trace the origin of organized religion much further back than Fraser thought we could. We can probably take it back for several thousand years. Well, let's look in more detail at the Eden story itself. Okay, the expulsion from Eden. Here we have it. Just after Adam and Eve had committed the first and perhaps the least original of all sins, which was to discover they were naked and actually looked a bit different from each other and had potential hints at what one might do about that. Of course, the first thing they did was to put on aprons to hide their genitalia. God was understandably annoyed by this, and he expelled them from Eden. And he expelled them with the following words: "In the sweat of thy face shalt thou eat bread. The Lord God sent him forth from the Garden of Eden to till the ground." And of course, Eden was a wonderful place. There were animals ready to be killed and eaten. There were fruits to be eaten. There were berries to be plucked. In fact, Adam and Eve were hunter-gatherers. They didn't need to till the ground. They were chucked out, and they had to start farming. And many people have tried to fit the origin of religion to, indeed, the origin of farming, and there indeed is quite a lot of evidence that could be true. Now, what happened next? Of course, we had the next generation, Cain and Abel, and Cain killed his brother Abel in a classic farmer's dispute about the ownership of property, and Cain was then thrown out again further to the land of Nod. So where's the land of Nod? Here's the land of Nod. Here's, I don't know how well you can see this. I'm not sure this thing works. Most things in UCL don't, as you well know. Work, you useless bloody thing. Right, that's going to work? No chance. No chance. Okay, if you follow those arrows, the blue arrows, you'll see the word Nod, and just that's the land of Nod. It's just east of Eden to the land of Nod. And if you look, you'll see paradise there. That's Eden. So that's where he went. It was a real place in the eastern part of the Eastern Mediterranean, and he was sent out there. And what happened next? What happened there? That was the place where farming originated. Farming originated in the land of Nod. Direct proof, of course, of the truth of the biblical tale, possibly. Okay, and that's the land of Nod. That's where farming began about 10,000 years ago. Pigs, cattle, sheep, and goats, and the like. They started exactly where the Bible says that farming itself began with the expulsion from Eden. Okay, what happened with farming, of course, was there was a huge explosion of population. By many, many times, and people began to move out from the center of farming and began to move to the east and to the west. And as they did, they changed. They changed in many ways. They changed in particular in the language they spoke. Here's the Tower of Babel. Okay, the Tower of Babel is on the other side of Eden. I don't know whether you can see it. If you follow the arrows again, you'll see that tower, Babel Tower. This is what it looks like. It's the Tower of Babel. And of course, we've got to remember that until probably the 18th century, everybody had a creationist view of the origin of language. The way that language originated was that man, in his arrogance, decided to build a tower to heaven. God, being a bit of a NIMBY, didn't like that idea of lots of city dwellers landing in his little paradise, and they all spoke the same language, so God afflicted them with language. All the bricklayers spoke Polish, all the plumbers spoke Chinese, all the painters and decorators spoke Welsh, and so on, and understandably, under those circumstances, the Tower of Babel went nowhere. And that was the view of the origin of language. But that all changed, really. Perhaps the only famous scientist called Jones is a guy called William Jones, who began to study languages, and he went to school not in Eton, so he didn't have a real education, but he did go to Harrow. Okay, and William Jones, as every schoolboy in Harrow in the 18th century could do, and no doubt it's still true, he could speak fluent Latin, Greek, and Hebrew. He was an extraordinary linguist, and he very rapidly learned effectively all the European languages. And then when he was a young man, he was sent in the mid-18th century, late 18th century, to India as a merchant, and he began to learn Indian languages too. And he was startled to find that among some of the languages of northern India, there were clear similarities between the words spoken in French or Greek or English and the languages of northern India. Some of them are just fairly obvious. There are various numbers, 2, duo, dva in Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is an extinct language of northern India, which still possessed a large literary corpus, and William Jones actually said it was the most beautiful language he knew. Okay, and he thought, well, that's strange. Why should that be? Maybe these languages are related. What do we mean when we say that two languages are related? We mean that they descend from a common ancestor. And William Jones, in spite of the spirit of Darwin here, wrote down the first ever evolutionary tree, which is this, where he began to see if he could work out the patterns of relatedness and common descent of particular words, and as an extension, particular language. For example, in the modern Romance languages, the word for father is obvious, as we know, padre, per, pai, and so on. That clearly descends from the Latin pater. And at the time when Latin was a lingua franca, people were speaking in classical Greek or Sanskrit or Gothic, which became German. And you can see pater, Peter, and fadar are really rather similar. And he took a further step because he suggested that from these words written down in extinct languages which leave records, we might even be able to work out when particular, what the original language from which they descend actually was. And he reconstituted the word pater, which may have been the word originally for father, and that's now been totally reconstituted into a language that's called Pi for Proto-Indo-European. And this is the root language of many of the European languages, not all of them, not Basque, for example, not Albanian, but certainly most of them, and many Indian languages, and indeed, as we'll see in a moment, even one or two extinct Chinese languages as well. Now, what you can do is you can, rather by waving your hands, you can look at the differences between these languages and make the assumption, that it's a daring assumption, that the rate of change of language over time has been more or less constant, so that we can, we know when Latin was spoken, we know when French started to be spoken, and you can work out the rate of change. And if you do that, and you superimpose the results on a map, you get rather an interesting picture. What have we got here? This is a map of Europe, okay, as you can see, and of northern India. And you can see that, in the main group, the oldest language, so the root of all the languages about 8,000 years ago, leads to two languages called Anatolian and Tocharian. Okay, and Tocharian is particularly interesting. It's been rediscovered. We rediscovered only about 20 years ago with lots of manuscripts found in the Chinese deserts, and it is an Indo-European language, and it's the remnant of one of the oldest ones, in fact. Another fairly old one is Anatolian, and then as we move over towards the west, and indeed as we move over from Anatolian towards the east into India, we get younger and younger languages until we get, for example, in Wales and Ireland, we get my own native tongue, which is Welsh, the Celtic languages, which emerged relatively recently. And clearly what happened was that the evolutionary process, what did Darwin define evolution as being? Descent with modification. And that's exactly what language is. I mean, when I came to UCL longer ago than I would like to admit, when did I come here? 42 years ago. Well, the students, generally speaking, spoke rather like this. I mean, most of them went to rather good schools, and they spoke practically good English. Well, I've just been talking to some of my undergraduates, and they say, well, Steve, they say, is this lecture going to be on the web then, all right? Now, you can mock that, but in fact you can pick up changes in language of that kind very easily over 10, 20, 100, 200 years. And you imagine how, if you've got 10,000 years, how many changes you might actually have. So the languages indeed did seem to begin in the place where farming began. They changed as the population exploded and moved across Europe. And you can see that population explosion as being, well, let's not bother with that. Here's a recent paper on the patterns of population growth in different parts of Europe as farming arrived. And you can see the blue arrows show the arrival of farming, and the red segments are population booms, often followed by busts when diseases start spreading, but that's another story. And you can see, for example, in Scotland, as soon as they found out to grow porridge oats, the population boomed. In the Paris Basin, where farming got there rather earlier, population boomed yet again, and that's true everywhere. As soon as farming arrives, there's a population boom. And there's an enormous change in the structure of society. Because if you look at hunter-gatherer societies, generally they're rather equitable. They tend not to have one strong leader who tells everybody what to do. There tends to be quite a lot of turnover in leaders, and if somebody gets too strong, the others either tear him down or occasionally even kill him. And of course there's small groups as well. It's worth noting, as of course you're aware, that every one of you on your way to UCL today saw more people on that journey than the average human being over history, who would have been a hunter-gatherer, the average human being saw in his or her own lifetime. So with the origin of farming and the population explosion, the nature of society changed. And indeed, you have some hints of that in places. This famous site here you may have heard of, Göbekli Tepe, which is by far the oldest known building ever found. It's about 11,000 or a bit, or even a bit older, 11,000 years older, which is several thousand years older than in fact, it's 8,000 years older than the Giza Pyramid and much older than Stonehenge. And it's remarkably sophisticated. You can see where it is, slap bang in the Fertile Crescent, close to where the Tower of Babel was. And you can see it is sophisticated. There are a number, it's not fully excavated, it was only found in the 70s, a number of circular buildings. And if you look at the bottom right here, you can see some steels, some stones, with sophisticated carvings upon them, showing, for example, lots of vultures, suggesting that maybe it was a sky burial society like the Zoroastrians, where they put out their dead to be eaten by vultures. But it's clearly a sophisticated society. You couldn't build that with a bunch of hunter-gatherers, all of whom were arguing about, what color to paint the living room. You would have to have a strong ruler who could order people around to do that. And that may well have something to do with the origin of inequality and of a certain form of religion. There's Ur of the Chaldees, where Abraham was born, not nearly as old as Göbekli Tepe, but still pretty old. And it's very noticeable that as these towns and cities began to appear, for the first time, you see defensive walls. You see nations and empires appearing. You see wars. You see extreme wealth. Somewhat after Abraham, there came Solomon. Now the weight of gold that came to Solomon was 606 talents of gold, 40,000 stalls of horses for his chariots. Sounds a bit like Bill Gates in many ways. And enormously wealthy. So a total revolution in society then. Now, if we look at the nature of the gods involved, you see that among the many religions that emerged during that time, they share one thing, almost all of them share one thing in common, that they have a punitive and powerful God. And if you annoy God, it's not going to be good for you. Hinduism has Yama, who's the god of death. Chinese have the 10 kings of hell. Christianity, of course, has Judgment Day, when all the sinners, that's all the people who go to UCL, not the ones who go to King's College, of course, who go to heaven. All the sinners are cast into the burning fiery pit. And even Buddhism, which is always seen as rather calm, in fact has a great wheel of life and the realms of suffering if you generate bad karma. So if you're naughty, God will punish you. And that all seems to have started at about that time. Now you can see remnants of the way that started in anthropological literature, which dates something back for 100 years. And people have been interested in religions as anthropologists for a long time. What you find is some rather striking patterns. Now, what you can define gods. There are basically three kinds of gods around the world. There are powerful gods of the kinds which we're used to, where we daren't blaspheme in case a stroke of lightning comes and burns us up. There are distant gods. They're high gods, but they're not bothered. They're the ones who are shown in pale grey in this. And they're up there, and they make the rains fall, and they make the crops grow, but they really can't be bothered with these boring humans wandering around on the surface of the earth. They're just insects. They're unimportant. And there's an intermediate lot, which there are high gods up there who could interfere, but generally they don't. Okay? And then at the bottom, we've got the high gods who are active and moral and just constantly spying you out, a bit like parking in Camden Town. You can never, ever get away with it. And what's striking is that if you look at foraging societies, hunter-gatherer societies, versus pastoral societies, where people have settled down and they have flocks and herds that they move around, there's an immediate rocketing up in the proportion of gods who are active and angry all the time. Okay? And if you move to the next step again, if you move on from societies which are gardening societies, where every peasant family has his or her patch of land, to families where you've got to places where you've got intensive agriculture, where you have a large landowner with people working for him, once again you see with the increase in secular power of the boss, you have an increase in the incidence of active and moral high gods who are constantly surveying what's going on, and if you do something wrong, you're going to get into real trouble. And you can simplify it even further, and you can ask, okay, let's go to population densities, population sizes, and ask, what's the patterns there? And you can see that as population densities go up, then the incidence of high gods across the world also goes up. Right? So there's something perhaps to do with the maintenance of dense human populations. That may well be where these forms of gods came from. You can argue it in two ways. I mean, Karl Marx, of course, said, and right as he invariably was, that opium is the religion of the people. The reason behind these high gods was to fool the poor to remaining poor, because God had decided this. There is an opposing view, and I think they're of equal value, which says you cannot maintain a society of this kind unless you have a hierarchy in which everybody believes. So in the end, everybody gains. Well, either of those could be true, but I have to say that if you look at the figures today in modern populations, perhaps it suggests that Karl Marx himself had something else, had something to do. Well, let's look at a bit at the modern world. It's a striking tendency, not a universal tendency, but there's somewhat of a tendency that poor countries tend to be, people in poor countries tend to be more religious than people in rich countries. But that isn't by any means the whole story, because actually what really drives the level of religiosity, as it's called, in a particular country isn't the absolute value of wealth. It is the inequality within the country. And as many of you will know, there's a thing called the Gini index, which measures inequality. And if you've got a society with an annual income of $1 million, let's say, and if one man has the $1 million, nobody else has anything, the Gini index would be 1. If you had a society of $1 million and 1,000 people, and everybody at $1,000, then the Gini index would be 0. So that the more equal the society, the lower the Gini index. And there are some rather big differences across the world, of course. You can see that the United States is the most unequal. Britannia rules the waves the rules of equality, that's for sure. Britain is just behind the United States, and at the bottom you've got places like Finland and Sweden. Okay. Now I have to say the United States by far not the worst offender by any means. Places like Nigeria are worse. Places like Brazil are worse. Okay. But these are the kinds of pictures. Yeah, they're quite big differences, really. Okay. So we can go out and we can work out the Gini index for various countries. That's often been done, and you can ask. And this too has often been done. What are people's religious belief? And here we've got the Gini index at the bottom from 20 to 60 and various measures of those who believe or don't believe in God. People who identify themselves as religious or believe in God or believe in an afterlife, believe in heaven, think of God very important. There's an absolutely striking fit between these parameters. It's actually a much better fit than the simple patterns of wealth. Is the country rich or poor? As, of course, you can see, perhaps best of all, in the United States. There is a thing the United Nations uses called the Successful Society Scale. And that's objective enough. You ask, what's the crime rate? What's the childhood death rate? How many people are in education? What's the employment rate? That kind of stuff. And you can make the Successful Society Scale from 0 to 10, and you'll see once again there's a striking tendency for more successful societies to have a lower belief in God, and the outlier is indeed the United States, which for some people is a very successful society, but for many others is extremely unsuccessful. Okay, and you can see again this remarkable linear fit. So it does seem then that we may have some kind of handle on the way that religion perhaps emerged. It responds, it emerges in societies which are highly unequal, and it acts to maintain that inequality. Or put it another way, it could well be that unequal societies need religion to stop them from breaking down. All right? And I think, however you interpret it, the facts are really quite impressive. Now, Darwin himself was pretty sure that there was an evolutionary basis for religion. Now, I'll go into that in a moment. Many of us, and myself certainly, would regard ourselves as not being religious. I mean, I went to chapel, Welsh Presbyterian chapel, often enough to ensure that I would grow up to be an atheist, that's for sure. And many of us believe, with some evidence, that in the places that we know, the countries that we know, that religion is less important than it was. And you can see, if you look at the lines for Britain here, Christian versus no religion. In 2009, there are now more people who profess to be atheists and agnostics than those who profess to be Christians. Okay, and that's oddly enough still also true in the United States. There's been a great drop there too. So you might clap yourself on your agnostic back and say, well, that's all wonderful. But in fact, you're fooling yourself. Globally, that isn't true at all. Now, Darwin, as I said, was very much concerned with the human evolution, including man's emotions and indeed man's society, and as part of that, man's religion. And his famous phrase, which he made while he was living on a house on this site, was after having read Thomas Moffett's For Amusement, God help us if you've ever read it. He read Moffett's For Amusement, and Malthus is the man who said that populations will outgrow resources. Populations will go 2, 4, 8, 16, 32, and resources will only go 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So there's always going to be too many people around. Okay? And Darwin said, at last I have a theory to work with. And the theory of evolution is, in effect, a demographic theory. It's a theory which has to do with successful reproduction. It's, the natural selection turns on the fact on inherited differences in reproductive success. And if you don't survive, or you don't find a mate, or you don't have any children, then your evolutionary value effectively, to put it crudely, is 0. So the demography, numbers, and differences in numbers from place to place are what drives evolution of society and indeed of DNA, for that matter. Now, farming, of course, saw a huge shift in demography, and we've seen the way that society evolved under that. But what's really startling is that if you look at the demography of religious versus non-religious people across the world, the effect is really quite striking. The red squares are a German survey. The number of children in the modern world that people have in Europe is strikingly related to how religious they are. They never go to church. The average woman has 1.4 children in Germany. If they go once a month, 1.7, and if they go more often, about 2. And globally, and they're the black spots, and these are many different surveys across the globe, exactly the figures, the same pattern. The more religious you are, the more children you have, okay? And that can have a big effect. Here we have the fastest growing ethnic group, if you can call them that, in the United States now. The Amish, many of you have been to the States, will have seen Amish people in northern Pennsylvania, for example. They are people who were in Switzerland and were expelled by religious extremisms, and then themselves, I have to say, became somewhat extremist and expelled other people. But what they do absolutely is have large numbers of children. And they don't believe in living, in many ways, an attractive religion. They don't like the modern world, and do you blame them? They have horses and carts rather than cars. The kind of reformed Amish are called the Black Bumper sect, because they're allowed to have cars as long as they paint the bumpers black, so they're not showing off for having shiny bumpers, but that's another story. And the average family size for the modern Amish, average fecundity for women, is about 6, and that's a lot. Now, the Amish, in 1900, there were only about 1,000 of them. In 2000, there were 180,000. And in 2100, given their present rate of growth, there will be as many Amish as there are people in the United States. Okay? So whether that will happen is another question, of course. But that's the rate of growth which they show. So that means that were that to happen, the Amish religion would become a dominant and successful religion. In that people who are born Amish tend to stay Amish. They're allowed out, actually, if they have a brief period just after adolescence. It's got a great name. It's called the Rumspringa. You can go into town and have a wonderful time, and then you realize after your 15th hangover, hang on, I'm not enjoying this much, and you go back and join the community, and they generally do. So there's a high heritability of belief in this group, as indeed there is in many others. So we can predict maybe the future of belief, the future of religion, of any religion, by asking what are the patterns of life and death in countries which are religious versus those which are not religious. And the answer is actually fairly straightforward. Here's the global fertility rate for number of children per woman. And most of the world, all over the world, really quite quickly went through what's called the demographic transition. And the demographic transition is the shift between high numbers of births and high numbers of deaths, which was everywhere in the Middle Ages and later, to what we have in the developed world now, which is low numbers of births and low numbers of deaths. And everywhere, from China to India, everybody has gone through it with astonishing speed. Almost everywhere has gone through it with astonishing speed. People once thought it would take 100 years, 200 years, 300 years for India to go through the demographic transition. Forget it, it's almost through it now. Okay, so it's happened very quickly with one exception, and the one exception, as you can see, is in sub-Saharan Africa. And the number of fertility of children per woman in some places is up to 7 or 8. Okay, now that's clearly going to have a highly, quite a considerable effect on demography. God's first instruction to his people in Genesis is go forth and multiply. Okay, as a biologist, I always say when I'm talking about evolution, but they went forth and divided, but that doesn't really work. In Africa, people listened, okay, and they're still going forth and multiply. And you can see that that's going to have a huge effect. You can see it in some senses by asking what are the global frequencies of skin color genes, black versus white. In 1492, across the world, before Europeans started moving, there were many more genes for white skin color in the world. About equal numbers of genes for white skin color and black skin color in the world. As Europeans filled the world, there were many, many more genes for white skin color, which has nothing to do with the properties of skin. Now that's reversed. Okay, because the European people of white skin color have rather small families. People with dark skins in Africa tend to have rather large families. So you can have a shift, a considerable shift in the patterns of population growth. You can see decrease in Europe, massive increase in Africa. If you project that into the future, that's even more striking. Bear in mind, this is a logarithmic scale. This is 0, 10, 100, 200, 0, 10, 100, 1,000, and that kind of stuff. And if you look at those, there's a population growth of the world, no doubt. But the only one, just about the only one, that really stands out is the African population. And indeed, in 2050, on this graph, something like a quarter of the entire world's population will be of African origin. Okay? So how does that fit with our thesis about the origin of religion? Africa, in some sense, is reliving what happened in the origin of farming, because the African economy, in spite of all the stuff you hear, much of Africa's economy is actually booming. They're doing really rather well. And the population growth is going to be enormous. Well, Africa, of course, is not just the world center of fecundity, but also the world center of religion. And here, irrespective of what the religion might be, are the levels of belief in different religions across the world. And the paler green, the bit higher the levels of belief. And you can see quite strikingly that Africa has the highest levels of belief. Brazil and so on are fairly high, and they have fairly high population growth. Everything pales compared to Africa. So what that allows us to do, maybe, is to look forward. And I have to say, and I feel fairly neutral about this, having worked quite a lot in Africa myself, I have to say that if you look forward, it's clear that Christianity is booming, will continue to boom, and will probably go back in terms of proportion of the population that believes in it to what existed in the Middle Ages. Now, that you may or may not like that idea, but if to an evolutionist, at least it's a comforting thought that even if religion triumphs, it will do so for biological reasons. So I'll stop there. Thank you. I have to say, I'm so used to giving to the minute lectures to students that we don't have any time for questions. Thank you. Waterstones are still open.